Welcome to Mythcrashers. We weren't invited to the party, but we came to talk about myths anyway. We are talking today about the plagues of Egypt. We'll talk a little bit later in the show about why we're discussing the plagues of Egypt today. But you may know this story already if you've seen The Prince of Egypt or the Ten Commandments. The story is told in the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible. It was probably composed between the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, based on earlier oral traditions. Exodus is generally about the Israelites escaping slavery in Egypt and arriving in Canaan to make a covenant with Yahweh, the God of Israel. The episode of the plagues begins because the prophet Moses gathers together the Israelite elders and tells them to go into the wilderness to hold a festival for Yahweh. Pharaoh, the unspecified ruler of Egypt, denies the enslaved Israelites the right to go and hold the festival, saying that he does not know God. God then sends a series of plagues onto Egypt to demonstrate his power. In the Exodus version, there are 10 plagues. The first is that the river Nile turns to blood. Then there's a plague of frogs, a plague of lice, a swarm, which is some versions say wild animals and others say flies, but they cause harm to people and livestock. Then there's a disease of livestock. Then there's a plague of boils, a storm of hail, thunder, and lightning, a plague of locusts, then 3 days of darkness, and finally, the death of every firstborn son in Egypt, except those of the Israelites who are told to mark their doors with lamb's blood, so the spirit of death will pass over them, which is the origin of the Jewish Passover festival. The final plague convinces Pharaoh to release the Israelites so they can travel to Canaan.
To Canaan?
To Canaan, the land of milk and honey, as I understand it.
First question, just like, this is for Chrissie. Do you know, perchance, the origins of is Exodus a Greek word?
Yes. Yeah. It means the journey out, the way out. So it's about, that's why it's the book is about the Jews or the Israelites, however we want to conceive of them, escaping Egypt, leaving Egypt and going out of Egypt. So yeah, it just means leaving.
Yeah, I know this isn't like fully your area of expertise, but does that occur like anywhere else in the Old Testament? That there are books that are named after ancient Greek, or is it just Exodus?
Yeah, so a lot of biblical terms are from Greek. So like apocalypse is like from a Greek word, which I cannot recall right now. Apocalypto, I guess. Corinthians, I mean, Corinth is a Greek city. I'm trying to remember names of the Bible now, and I don't know a whole lot of them. Genesis, that's a Greek word. Yeah. So, I mean, the Bible is written in Hebrew and in Greek. So and there are similarities between those two languages, although they're very far from identical. But yeah, so there's definitely Greek present here.
Okay, I'm going to express my overwhelming naivety and general lack of knowledge, because I thought the Bible was the Old Testament especially, was entirely written in Hebrew.
Yeah, it's a whole mix of languages. And I think the Old Testament does tend more towards Hebrew and Aramaic, but I think later, kind of when it's being compiled is when the names get put on, and that's when Greek speakers are dealing with it, because at some point Greek kind of becomes the language of the educated.
Did you sit on the naming committee, Chrissie?
I wish I had. You know, I love a name, a changing of a name.
Plastow names the books of the Bible.
Brilliant. But no, at whichever point in history, Greek becomes kind of the language of the educated. Particularly in Egypt, for example, you have Demotic Egypt. This is now, I was going to say a little exodus, actually, a little excursion on language, which I will stop very soon.
No, I'm interested.
No, I'm here for it.
But
I'm here for this exodus.
Very briefly, in Egypt at various times, you get people speaking, obviously, native Egyptian languages, which tends to be called demotic, which is now kind of used as a derogatory term for like demotic French, for example, is a line from, I think, a T.S. Eliot poem, but it means like kind of not of the educated. It's like very everyday, kind of almost broken or not correct language. Anyway, demotic Egyptian language originally just means like a native Egyptian dialect. And then you have Greek as a language of commerce because Egypt is trading with Greek-speaking cities, and also a language of education, and particularly of medicine, because Hippocrates and Galen, who originate a lot of medical thought, are both writing in Greek. And then obviously Latin comes in at some point when the Romans come to Egypt, and so you have so many languages being spoken. And I think probably at some point in there, you know, the Bible is always being compiled and kind of edited, and you probably get Greek names slapped onto text, so they're actually written in another language. I mean, for example, we tend to call the play Oedipus, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the king. Often we call it Oedipus Rex, which is actually Latin. Oedipus Tyrannos is the Greek name, but it's less considered as that, even though it's clearly a Greek text. So things get given weird names.
I like that as a conclusion. Things are given weird names. Interesting. Okay, the plagues, Nicole. So I'm sure, like, undoubtedly we'll get to the subject of, like, probably like the worst plague. I'm going to go in with. So, what do you think is the plague that you would just completely ace? You'd smash. Right, you just be like, it's easy. Darkness for me, because whatever.
Personally, I feel the River of Blood is pretty dramatic, and like, I think he really nails it on the first one. So he like only goes down from there. Like, where do you go from River of Blood? Plague of Frogs?
Do you think that's the one that you'd initially be like, "Ooh, actually, this is quite interesting"? Obviously, not knowing.
Honestly, I think that would like kind of convince me at least that Moses was a sort of David Blaine-esque figure. I'd be like, "Ooh, he knows how to do his shit." So, yes, I think the River of Blood would win me over, and I'd be like, "Yes, free those Israelites." He knows his drama. He knows his dramaturgy. Okay. How exactly would you ace the darkness? Are you like good with a little torch?
Just like, oh, it's fine anyway. The outside world sucks.
Like, 3 days of darkness. I think you mean the first 3 days after lockdown in 2020. Me sitting alone in my room.
It's cool. No one needs to go outside. It's all right. Like, I mean, I'm assuming that I'm existing in quite a bougie Egyptian lifestyle. I'm sure if I had to actually go to work, apart from like all the dead livestock everywhere and the dead frogs and the boils on my feet, like already making life difficult enough, and now I can't even see all of the dead cows to trip over them, I think it'd be fine. I think I would ace it, smash it. Everyone's like been asleep for 3 days before.
I could see you like swanning around in some Egyptian cotton.
Chrissie, is there a plague you think you'd enjoy?
A plague I'd enjoy. Yeah, I really like a thunderstorm. I really like a thunderstorm. So I think I would not mind, as long as I was indoors or at least under some form of non-metallic shelter. I could probably sit through a storm of hail, thunder, and lightning quite happily. I think, God, do you not think over the pyramids? That would be like super dramatic, like thunder and lightning over the pyramids. Yeah.
The houses always look super sturdy in these movies, so.
Yeah, they're all stone, or like mud bricks.
Or like mud brick, yeah.
Maybe that.
I feel it'd be fine.
Reference point. Houses look really good in these movies.
They do. They look very sturdy. Not like a wooden shack, you know.
And I think like probably the hail and the lightning is like defo the most Instagrammable plague. It's the prettiest one.
Well, so that we're now a few episodes deep into myths but I don't think we have really defined what a myth is, have we? I mean, in the context of religion, it can be quite a sensitive matter. Wouldn't you agree, Chrissie?
Yeah, so a lot of people today would probably not consider this story about the plagues of Egypt to be a myth, or would even find that nomenclature offensive, because nowadays we tend to think of a myth as a story that isn't true. Like that in the modern world is probably one of our most common associations with the word myth is, oh, that's just a myth about, I don't know, I can't think of any kind of like old wives' tales now, but, think something that's obviously fake. Mythbusters, that kind of thing. I wish we could have had that title for our podcast, but we couldn't because it clearly already exists. But in the ancient world, which is arguably what we're talking about here, the word mythos, the Greek word mythos, which myth comes from, really just means a story. And there's not really any connotation attached to that in most sources as to whether it is true or false, or good or bad, or any kind of moral or ethical attachment to it. So for ancient people, myths are just stories. And in fact, a lot of ancient Greeks, for example, believed that their myths happened in what was to them the ancient past. So, when we really think about what a myth is, it might be a story that gets told over and over again and gains some kind of cultural importance to a particular culture. Often myths have elements of the fantastical or the supernatural in them. And I think it wouldn't be wrong to say that this story does have elements of the supernatural in it. That's not to say that, we're saying that the Christian God is like a ghost or something like this, but the things that happen in the story are not natural, right? So it has a lot of the trappings of what we would call a myth. And for the ancient Greek myths, those are associated with gods and other figures who were part of Greek religion. So we don't mean anyone any offense, or we don't try, by calling the story of the plagues of Egypt a myth, that's not trying to do it any disservice or say something about whether it did or didn't happen, or whether it is or is not important to various groups of people. It's just a way of thinking about this story as a story in a tradition of storytelling about important events, narratives that take on cultural meaning through time, and also stories that often have kind of supernatural elements in them. I think that would be fair to say.
I would agree. And actually, I originally studied this story, I guess, in my literature class in high school. He made us read parts of the Old Testament as like a basis for reading further stories following this, Shakespeare plays and whatever. So he considered it, my English teacher considered it a founding story, the way we might consider Greek myths founding stories. So I think it's a myth personally.
Another aspect of it that kind of makes it seem mythy to me, mythy is definitely not a word, but here we are, makes it seem mythy, is that it's like a self-contained narrative that's also part of a bigger narrative. Because, the story of the plagues of Egypt kind of begins when God or Yahweh says, go out into the desert and have a festival for me. And obviously the Israelites can't do that because they're enslaved, and it ends when they are able to leave Egypt. But within the Bible, outside of that narrative, you have things happening before that and things happening after that. And in other global mythologies, we see these kinds of cycles of myth that have self-contained episodes in them, but that also extend beyond that. So if you think about something like the Iliad, which is obviously a really central mythic text from Greek mythology, it's only one episode in the Trojan cycle, which extends from like the marriage of Peleus and Thetis Everyone in By Jove knows my obsession with the marriage of Peleus and Thetis and the rolling of the apple of discord. It then goes all the way down to, the death of Agamemnon and kind of joins up with other stories. So the Iliad is just one tiny section in that. And that's kind of how I see the plagues of Egypt within the Bible, if we consider the Bible as kind of like the Old Testament, let's say, as like a cycle of myth-type stories.
Well, Chrissie, tell us, don't the gods at one point send down a plague in the Iliad?
Yes, they do. At the very beginning of the Iliad, in fact, on my translation, it's page 2. The kind of instigating event for the Iliad is Agamemnon has this woman that he has, taken as booty that has been awarded to him as like a war prize. Basically, we're talking about a war where men are killed and women are captured, and the women are distributed among the men of the conquering army as property, as prizes. And this woman called Chryseis has been awarded to him as his property, and her father Chryses, who is a priest of Apollo, prays to Apollo and says, I want my daughter back. Basically, please have my daughter returned to me. Have the Greeks return my daughter to me. And in order to make this happen, Apollo looses a plague on the Greeks, a plague of arrows. He rains down arrows on the Greeks as they sit in their camp and kills animals and people, a little bit like the plagues of Egypt, actually. There's, it affects all life. So there we are. And then
arrows. It says arrows?
It says shafts in my translation. He rains down his shafts on them. I can read it to you if you would like. It says, the arrows clattered against the angry god's shoulder as he moved, and he came on like nightfall. Then sitting apart from the ships, he let fly an arrow, and his silver bow sang out with a terrible noise. For 9 days, the god's shafts ranged throughout the camp. Terrifying stuff.
I wonder why God did not try that on the Egyptians.
Not much of an archer, the Judeo-Christian god. Not known as an archer.
He could be, though. He's God. So I think that Chrissie has provided a perfectly reasonable explanation as to why we might discuss this story amongst other myths. There are a lot of film versions of this story. Why do you think that is? Anybody?
It's very visual as a story.
Yeah.
You get to depict a lot of weird stuff, like frogs pouring out of the sky, boils, extremely attractive to portray.
Well, I think it's interesting that it's been a popular story amongst the very time periods when we spend a lot of money on film, right? So there was the big silent film version by Cecil B. DeMille, and then he remade it back when we were getting big biblical epics like Spartacus and Ben-Hur in the 50s, right? And then the only time we've really had it since then is in animated versions. Well, there was a film, Exodus, 5 years ago, wasn't there? But it was all CGI. It doesn't count. But I think it does make for a big story that you don't mind paying a lot for a movie ticket to. What's your favorite film telling of it, Malinda?
Prince of Egypt.
Prince of Egypt. Why is the Prince of Egypt just one of the greatest animated films of all time?
Because I know, you were saying, I think it's always been very appealing cinematically, I guess, because it's such an incredibly visual story, which is an interesting contrast, I guess, to classic myths, i.e. ancient Greek, which, as far as I'm aware, in general, have had limited to no appeal cinematically. A lot of the Old Testament, because you think about like Jonah and the whale, okay, like big visual. Noah's Ark, which has also been made because Ridley Scott has made Noah and he made Exodus, both of which just featured white actors portraying people who were clearly from the Middle East, but it's fine.
I think you are right. Like biblical God is thinking on a grander scale than Greek Zeus. Like Zeus is like meting out like individual punishments. He's like, I'm not sure about you, cow. How about
Plus, the Bible has so much more family appeal. Whereas every story, most ancient Greek myths is so like PG-13 at best. It's like, and it's. I mean, they're so pure. Not to say that like the Old Testament was written for like a family demographic. Hey, get kids in. But a lot of the Old Testament stories, like many people, interestingly learn as children. Whereas classics, I don't know whether it's partly because the nature of classics is so complex and so very adult in nature. If you want to start talking about incest and murder and death and rape,
always,
yes, yeah. I don't know whether that in any way is significant in terms of the way that, like Chrissie was talking about, like the idea of these stories being myths. They're so much more accessible. Maybe that's it. And because obviously there is that fundamental tenet of them being aspects of religion, of the second biggest religion in the world, that there is something of the scale of God's work, shall we say, that isn't characteristic in some senses, beyond kind of, because obviously like the only Greeks, the most common Greek stories that people are introduced to, or certainly for me, were like the concept of like the like Jason and the Argonauts. That's which still is quite adult in its way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that maybe the Bible stories don't need as much sanitizing as Greek myth does to be introduced to children. Like, I mean, let's be real. The death of every firstborn son in Egypt is pretty gnarly, but I think you can present it to children in a way that is like, just, they died, you know, they don't have to think about like how they died or what the reaction of the people whose children died might have been. Whereas with a lot of Greek mythology, the versions that we teach to children are really sanitized versions with a lot of things taken out. So you get like, you get stories like Theseus and the Minotaur, and Ariadne helps Theseus escape from the labyrinth by giving him the ball of string. And the part that usually isn't taught to children is the part where Theseus then takes Ariadne with him, but because he doesn't actually want to marry her, he just abandons her on an island on the way home. And she's like watching his ship disappear over the horizon, like, well, now I'm kind of fucked because I thought this guy was into me and clearly he is not. That part gets left out of the version we tell children. And also the part where Theseus like rapes every single person he meets. So, you know.
I have a question, and maybe nobody can answer this, but why are there so few monsters in the Bible, right?
Ooh.
Why are there so many monsters in Greek myths? But like, is Jonah and the whale a monster? Are there other monsters in the Bible?
Maybe all the monsters get wiped out in the flood. Who knows?
Noah doesn't take two of each on the ark.
Yeah. It's not a world of monsters.
He leaves the minotaurs behind.
That's really interesting that it's the biblical world isn't really a world of monsters, but the other gods are acknowledged, right?
Well,
because
I wonder if there were monsters, and sort of when Chrissie got together with all the other biblical scholars to put the Bible together, did they cut them out?
Yeah, we did. Sorry.
Well, you were just on the naming committee, so that wasn't really your job. But
the original manuscript had like huge basilisks and everything in it.
We are joined today by James Potter. They are an actor and dramaturg. Thanks so much for joining us, James.
Hi, Nicole.
How are you today?
Yeah, I'm okay. Yeah.
Are you excited to be here to talk about the plagues of Egypt?
I'm very excited and actually quite nervous. I didn't think I'd be as nervous because I love to talk, especially if it's about myself. So
you are excellent at talking, I have to say.
Oh my gosh, stop, you flirt.
We gave everybody a choice what episode they wanted to come on. So you picked today, The Plagues of Egypt. What drew you to it?
Because there's a few reasons that I really enjoy this story, and the main one is because it's incredibly camp. It's so camp. It's just like the god in this story just throws a massive hissy fit and does it in the most ridiculously camp, ludicrous, decadent way possible. Obviously, it ends with the murder of the firstborn son, which is kind of expected in kind of God vengeance striking down with lightning.
Is it expected? Is that the natural progression of things?
I think it's expected in the way that, like, when you think about like an angry God, you think about God throwing a lightning bolt and that person's dead, which is just straight up murder. I think there's a big difference between that and, oh, you're really annoying me, so I'm going to turn all of your water into blood. Like,
no, you're right. He could have gone straight for the killing, but he didn't.
Could have gone straight for the killing and decides instead to be
really drag it out.
Like just a cackling Bond villain, like just
really sadistic
and I'm not to use the word evil because I don't think it's evil because it's above that, but just kind of these cackling, almost playful, awful things that just escalate and escalate and escalate. I just think that's camp.
What's your earliest memories of this story, James?
I think my earliest memory of the story is the Rugrats version of which is, I think, really interesting because I was brought up in the north of England and I was brought up in a C of E school, and you don't really learn a lot about the Jewish community.
Tommy Pickles is Jewish, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, and there's a bit where they talk about the bread that they eat, which didn't rise because the yeast wasn't put in it, and Chucky does it wrong, and then he gets in trouble, and Tommy Pickles in the wee Moses basket, and just kind of it was really interesting because you kind of learn the story from a Christian point of view, being raised at a C of E school, but it was kind of just like a toe dip into how Jewish people view and tell this story, which was really enlightening. But my earliest memory of this story is Tommy Pickles.
It's interesting, isn't it? The sort of Old Testament stories that Christianity picks and chooses, though they are really more a part of Jewish tradition. This is one that that Christian families choose to tell their children maybe this, and like Noah's Ark, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, because kids love camp, and their camp stories. I mean, like Noah's Ark is it has the numbers and it has the animals, and it finishes with a nice little rainbow over the top of it, and it's all tied up with they're like two sides of the same coin, where it's like God's wrath and the joy that it brings, and then the other side of the coin where it's like evil God, naughty God this time, God in his emo stage. Like, do you prefer a nice God or a naughty God? I prefer my gods to be a bit more chill. You
prefer Rainbow God to a Plague of Locust God?
Oh, I don't even like Rainbow God. Rainbow God it's the rainbow, and when you see it, you've got to think of me. And I prefer my gods to be a bit more kind of just like, cool. Like New Testament God is more my vibe. Like he's just like, yo, check it. Like, be nice to everyone. I'm off. I'll see you later. Just don't be a dickhead. And I can fuck with that.
What do you think as a culture has really drawn us to this story?
Oh God. The drama of it all. Like, it's a biblical soap story. Like, every week it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I think it's the build up, and it's a really hard question because I don't really know what draws us to it at all. We just kind of gravitate towards it.
Well, as we were discussing before, it's been remade so many times, right? Rugrats. Yeah. And you were talking about a Simpsons episode before we were...
The Simpsons episode, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a favorite retelling of it? Is it The Simpsons?
I do like the Simpsons version, but I mean, everybody's seen Prince of Egypt, and I do enjoy Prince of Egypt.
And you have to admit, this is the best scene in the film. I sent my pestilence and plague. Come on. Well, a chorus chanting in the background.
I think the bit that sticks out for me is the final plague. And artistically, it's beautiful in the fact that they kind of have this fog as representative of God. But it's not that gets me. I think whenever I think about that movie, I think about that it's that plague and all the kids die, and then it's not that part. It's really hard to explain. It's just as all the kids are dead and the fog goes back into the sky and it goes back into a just like a normal nighttime sky. And they leave a pause of about 4 or 5 seconds where it's just silent. And then you just start hearing one woman screaming and crying. And then all of the screaming and crying like builds to like a cacophony of screaming and crying as these people. And I think that was just such like a powerful piece of storytelling.
The dramaturgy of the piece is really good. The whole film
dramaturgy of the piece,
like the exhale of the death, right?
Yeah, well, I always love silence, either on stage or in film. I just think there's so much to be said just by having periods. And like, I think one of the reasons why it's so strong there is because it feels like a breath. Like you just wait for that silence to finish, and it's painful.
This is a Prince of Egypt fan podcast, actually.
I did enjoy Prince of Egypt, the movie. It's an enjoyable movie.
It really is. But it is a children's film, as we were saying about. This is one of the stories parents choose to tell their children from the Old Testament, right? So it's interesting that they did indeed choose it to make an animated film of, when the great majority of other animated films are based in fairy tales and not Bible stories. So, assuming you clocked that everyone was putting the lamb's blood above their door, right? And you do the same. Which plague is the worst for you, James?
So, yeah, we're avoiding the final plague. I was reading recently, because there's a lot of, I think lots of people know that there's a lot of reading and research into how scientifically these curses or plagues may have happened. And I was reading one theory was the boils plague comes directly after the plague of gnats or midges or some unspecified biting insect.
I read one where
yeah. And they were theorizing that okay, I'm just going to say it now. Anybody who's listening, if you want to avoid listening to something disgusting, like maybe come back in 30 seconds, 45 seconds, put it on mute, get yourself a cup of tea, come back. Yeah. So they've theorized that the boils were actually where the biting insects had bitten the people of Egypt, laid their eggs under their skin, and then the eggs were hatching and bursting out of people's parts, which cause these red rising,
Oh my God.
stinging. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot.
I think you've probably pushed that up everyone's list of worst plagues, and I think we're all thankful that that's not the plague we're currently living through.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I really could do with not having insects bursting out of my skin. Thanks.
Chrissie, are you with us? You want to tell us what the worst plague for you would be?
Yeah, I mean, I have a thing about the 3 Nights of Darkness, and I think that it's just I mean, I'm a daylight person. I've embraced the fact that I am probably a morning person, even though I don't feel like one necessarily. And like, I'm not very sort of seasonal affective disordery, but I do like to be in the sunshine, or at least in the light.
Yeah.
And the idea of it just not getting light, I mean, I guess there's parts of the world where that's quite normal for people, but it's not normal in the part of the world that I live in. And so it's just like not getting light in the morning, and then it's not getting light all day. And then maybe you don't know how long that's going to go on for, unless you're Moses and you're in the know. Like, what if the sun never comes up again? Mm-hmm. The implications of that are horrendous. And I think that's the point where I would be starting to think, I can't explain this in any way other than that maybe there is an almighty, omnipotent God that I haven't been worshipping up until this point, and that would truly freak me out.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that Pharaoh waits so long to give in, right? Yes, his son has to die for him to give in. The 3 days of darkness doesn't do it for him.
Yeah, I mean, if I was Pharaoh, I would be giving in. Like, I would be done. I would have been done way before even the darkness. I would have, if that's the boils, I would have been done at the boils.
I know we were joking earlier about the frogs, that the frogs was kind of like a half-assed one on God's part. But like, the moment my palace was covered in frogs, I'd be like, it's fine. You can go into the wilderness. I don't need you anymore.
I feel like I'd maybe like stick out 1 or 2 plagues. Like the frogs, I could be like, okay, annoying, but you're saying it's an all-powerful God, and he's just sent some amphibians around my house. Like, you know, I'm not too scared. Mm-hmm. I think when the whole room is filled with flies, and this is like the 6th or 7th time this is happening to me, I'd probably just like call it a day.
So do you think first time he thought, oh, it's a coincidence the frogs have turned out?
I think it may have been. And he had all of his wee people with him being like, oh, we can do that too. So I feel like when you're surrounded by a bunch of yes men and they're all saying we can do that too, isn't it the whole thing that like God makes his heart harden though? And he just kind of like...
Yeah. So I think that's definitely something that's in the Bible text, that God almost forces Pharaoh to be this way, right? Forces Pharaoh to say no.
Yeah, he hardens his heart, is what I've always heard or read, which just kind of feels a bit mean, to be honest. To be like, oh, I'm gonna, like, for all intents and purposes, I'm gonna put a spell on you, which means you're gonna say no, and then still do these horrible things to you, and you should be saying yes, but really, he gaslights him. Oh my God, he gaslights him. God is a gaslighter. Well, because I mean, there's the old free will argument. To what extent does Pharaoh have free will to say no to Moses, right? Well, none, because God's hardening his heart.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first plague is a little different than the others, right? It's the bloody water, right? Do you consider that a plague?
I consider that an inconvenience. That would be very... I mean, it's camp, and I
think it's pretty classy, very theatrical.
Yeah, it's very theatrical. I've thought about so many times about doing Rivers of Blood on stage for different things. I always wanted to do... I cannot believe that I'm talking about it because I swore I'd never talk about it again. But I've always wanted to do a production of Electra where there would be like blood flooding the stage.
Electra,
yeah. Electra, yeah, I know. And it's like easy enough done. Like I feel like all he needed was some red food dye, some liquid glucose, and there you go. He's got it done. If I can make some fake blood to make a fake head with for the back eye, then Moses can do it too. He just popped down to Tesco and got the ingredients.
I know this is a big favorite of yours. The plague in general has become somewhat divorced from the context used in this ancient Egyptian story.
Yeah, it's interesting when we look at plague, because I think since working with people that have done adaptations, as an actor with people doing adaptations of Bible stories or looking at ways that we talk around the Bible, I think it's so fascinating to see how the entire book can change by the translation of one word. And I think plague is a really interesting translation from the Hebrew text. Although, again, as Chrissie says, disclaimer, not a Hebrew scholar. So, but I just do think it's interesting because when we reference the plague as in capital T, capital P, the plague, we're referencing Yersinia pestis, which is the bacteria that creates the bubonic or pneumonic plagues. There's 3 different tiers of the plague, all of them worse than the other. One of them makes your nose disintegrate backwards into your throat, so you actually end up swallowing and choking on your own nose. Anyway, I digress.
Wow.
When we talk about the plague, we mean that one. So the plague of like the Black Death that wiped out a third of Europe, or the plague of 1665 in London, is all the same disease, and it's the same bacteria, which is found basically with fleas, and yeah, I just think it's really interesting how we've kind of lost what we mean by the plague, and how that kind of gets connected with the word plague. And
honestly, I think our current pandemic has divorced the plague from our idea of the Black Death. I think until 2020, the plague very unambiguously always meant the Black Death, and like a certain period in the 1600s. But now we have other associations for the word plague, I feel.
Yeah. I think when you say like the plague, definitely, sure, we're talking about the Black Death. But when we use plagues, so the plagues of Egypt, it's not like there were 10 Black Deaths. What I would be interested in just like thinking about is the idea that the plague is an everlasting thing. Like it's been raging between fleas and this bacteria for several thousand years, and will be like going on for much longer than human existence is here. I wonder whether there's a kind of tie-in between the timelessness of that and the plague word that we use in, like, when we talk about the ancient Egyptian plagues as well. Just kind of like Chrissie said, unless you were Moses or Aaron and you're in the know, then these events, which we think may have stretched 3 days, but may have stretched longer or shorter, could have and must have felt never ending.
Yeah.
Like if you're, I feel like if we look back at, like, if we look at the sun going down for the 3 days, I look at it and I'm like, oh yeah, it's not my like worst one, but I wouldn't like it. The idea of the sun going down tomorrow and every news platform saying to us, we don't know where it's gone.
What a nightmare.
Would probably be the scariest thing that I could possibly think of. That is terrifying. And it's that stretch of time that I think would also be awful as well. Just kind of like the not knowing about how long that event is going to happen for. Not knowing how many. Imagine yesterday was the frogs, today's the lice. What's tomorrow going to bring? Yeah. I'm like, is it a 1 day thing? Is it like at midnight all the frogs disappear and then everybody kind of has like a quick fag and a biscuit, and then the next plague comes along? Or were those plagues happening for days and days and days and days and days? Or well, like the first few probably felt like coincidences, right? And then 4 days in, you must think, oh shit, what's happening tomorrow? But he creates a really good build, I have to say. God really like tops himself again and again there. You know, there's like a dicey minute where he's like, well, the lice, and then
the frogs, and so those are a little half-assed. But then he really builds to a crescendo with "I'm going to kill all the firstborn sons." Really, but I think dramatic.
I think that's such a, because there's been theological chats about the structures of the plague and whether it was actually 10 plagues or whether it was 3 sets of 3 or a grouping of 9 and then one extra one at the end. And I can roll with that. Like, I can see that there were 9 things that were plagues. There were 9 things where it was like, okay, I'm going to send in. I felt like everything else was to do with nature. So it's like, look, I can send in these animals. Look, I can send in those animals. Look, I can make the sun disappear. Look, I can make the water turn into things. And then that last one is kind of just God being like, fuck it, I'm just going to kill them. Done. Like, it's less theatrical. It's brutal and clean. And the others were large and theatrical and camp and filthy and messy. Yeah.
So James, here at By Jove, I'm sure you know, we are a theater company that turns myths into theater. So if this was a myth we were going to adapt, the plagues of Egypt, what would your approach be? What would you focus in on? How would you stage it? You've got $1 million. You're welcome.
Immediately get rid of people. Just get rid of all of them. Just don't have people. I think the first thing I do is be prepared to be like, we as a company would need to immediately have some serious and long conversations with members of the Jewish community to tell this story. We don't have any Jewish members of the company. And I feel like it wouldn't necessarily be our place to tell this story with confidence without thoroughly talking and making sure that that's part of the narrative and the storytelling, which is essential to this story in particular, I think, because it's so important to the Jewish community as well. I know that a lot of Jewish friends feel very passionately about this story and haven't been totally chuffed with some of the adaptations that have been made. So that would be step one, I'd say. And then I would want to kind of get rid of people, puppetry all the way for this story. I think.
So you're telling me you're going to sit and build 1 million locust puppets, tiny little finger puppets.
I don't feel like there would be a way to stage it with people and convey the horror that without using something like puppetry, which I think it's a much clearer way of conveying terror on this scale. There's some stories where I'm like, can you stage this? Can you stage it properly? Like,
what do you think? Can you stage the story?
I think you can stage it, just not with people, just with puppets.
So is Moses a puppet, or is Moses not a character at all?
Ooh. Do you know what?
How central do you think Moses and Pharaoh are to the story of this?
Or
is it mostly just God like throwing shit down?
I would say that I would want to tell this story from the perspective of somebody that isn't one of the central characters. I think when we tell this story, we see it either from the point of view of Moses or of the Pharaoh, and I think it would be especially effective, especially now that we are living with a plague. I think it would be much more powerful to have a story told from the point of view of somebody who just kind of sees these events happen and knows that 2 people are fighting, and to be detached from the power play and to kind of investigate how scary this story is, or how terrifying those experiences are for people when they're not the people making the decisions. Whether that would be a part of the Hebrew community, or whether it would be one of the like Egyptians. I don't know, but I think it would be interesting to hear those stories rather than just Moses and Pharaoh.
Absolutely. James, thanks so much for swinging by for the plagues of Egypt.
Oh my God, you're so welcome.
Come back soon to discuss other plagues.
Yeah, if you need me to talk about the Black Death at length, then I am here, and I have some disgusting stories.
We'll have to have you on our episode where we discuss Ring Around the Rosie.
Absolutely, 100%.
Thanks for joining us.
That's all right. Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of Mythcrashers. Thanks for listening. Mythcrashers is a podcast from By Jove Theatre Company, presented by Nicole Savin and Malinda Smith, produced by Christine Plastow, with audio editing by Alex Burnett. We're grateful to the Open University and our supporters on Patreon for supporting this project. If you'd like to support By Jove Theatre Company and hear some behind-the-scenes clips from this podcast, go to patreon.com/byjove. You can also find us on Twitter @ByJoveTheatre, on Facebook @ByJoveTheatre Company, or on our website at byjovetheatre.org.